The sound of boiling soup filled the air, that soft, rhythmic bubbling that always reminded me of home, of family, of warmth. I stirred the pot carefully, letting the steam fog up my glasses, smiling faintly as the familiar aroma wrapped around me. Cooking had always been my love language. It was how I cared, how I said I'm here for you. But that morning, the kitchen didn't feel like home. It felt like a stage one where I didn't belong anymore. Clara, my daughter-in-law, stood behind me, arms crossed, tapping her nails against the counter. I could feel her eyes on me, heavy, judging, impatient. Still, I tried to ignore it. I reached for the salt, just a pinch more, the way David liked it when he was little. And then, whack. The ladle came down hard on my wrist, spilling a splash of hot soup across my hand. The sting of heat was sharp, but her words cut deeper. "Who cooks like that?" she snapped, her voice slicing through the kitchen air like glass. For a moment, everything froze, the bubbling pot, the ticking clock, my heart. I stared at the soup dripping down my wrist, the steam rising between us like smoke from a battlefield. I was just trying to help," I stammered, clutching my burned hand. She grabbed the pot lid and slammed it down on the counter so hard it rattled the dishes. "I told you not to meddle in my kitchen," she yelled. "You old women never listen." Old women, the words echoed in my chest. I wasn't even sure which hurt more, the pain in my hand or the shame crawling up my throat. I looked toward the living room. My son David was sitting on the couch, phone in hand, the glow of the screen lighting his face. He didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't even look at me. "David?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "Nothing." The silence felt louder than Clara's shouting, colder, crueler. Clara scoffed, snatching the spoon from my hand. "You think you know everything just because you've been cooking longer than I've been alive. Newsflash, this isn't your kitchen anymore." I felt the tears sting my eyes, but I swallowed them down. Crying wouldn't help. Crying only made her roll her eyes, only made David sigh in frustration, only made me feel small. So instead, I stepped back, pressing my palm against the burn, and whispered, "I was only trying to make dinner for the family." She let out a mocking laugh. "Family? You mean my husband? My home? You've done enough already. Why don't you go sit somewhere and stay out of my way?" My heart clenched. My husband, my home. Words that once belonged to me now sounded like trespasses. For years, I had cooked in this very kitchen, for birthdays, for holidays, for the little boy who used to hug me after every meal and say, "Mom, no one cooks like you." That same boy was now sitting feet away, pretending not to hear as his wife tore through the last piece of my dignity. I took a shaky breath and whispered, "You shouldn't talk like that, Clara." Her head snapped toward me, eyes blazing. "Or what, you'll tell David?" Her tone dripped with mockery. For a moment, I almost did. I wanted to scream, yes. Yes, I'll tell him everything. But when I looked at him, at my son sitting there like a shadow of himself, numb, silent, I knew it wouldn't matter. He wouldn't take sides. He never did. I turned off the stove and wiped my trembling hands on a towel. "I'll go rest," I said softly. As I turned to leave, she muttered under her breath, "Yeah, go rest, you're good at that." That one sentence, so small, so sharp, felt like a knife twisting slowly in my chest. I walked down the hall, the weight of humiliation pressing on my shoulders. Every step away from that kitchen felt like surrender. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my red, swollen hand. The burn wasn't bad, a little ice would fix it. But there was no ice for the ache that settled deep inside me. I could still hear her voice, that cruel, mocking tone, and the sound of David's silence behind it. That silence was what hurt most. He used to defend me against the world when he was little. Once, when the neighbor boy called me old-fashioned, David, just 10 years old, puffed out his chest and said, "My mom's the smartest woman on earth." Now that same boy wouldn't even look up when his wife struck me. I bit down hard on my lip, trying to stop the tears, but they came anyway, slow, quiet, shameful. I didn't want anyone to hear, not even the walls that had seen everything. Outside my room, I heard Clara's laughter float down the hallway, carefree, victorious. She'd won that round, and we both knew it. But as I sat there, something in me began to shift, slowly, silently. Like a candle lighting itself in the dark. Humiliation burns, yes. But it also reveals, it shows you who people truly are. And in that painful moment, I finally saw Clara clearly, the greed, the arrogance, the hunger for control. And I saw something else too. David, not cruel, not heartless, but lost. Drowning in the mess he'd let into his life. I wiped my eyes, looked at my reflection in the mirror, the tired face, the bruised heart, the trembling lips, and whispered to myself, "You're stronger than this. You've survived worse." Because I'd survived losing my husband. I'd survived raising a child alone. I'd survived years of loneliness before David brought Clara into our lives. And if I'd survived all that, I could survive her. As I lay down that night, the burn on my wrist throbbed in rhythm with my heartbeat, a steady reminder that some pain demands action, not pity. I didn't know how yet. But I knew one thing for certain: I wouldn't let her keep treating me like a burden. Tomorrow, I'd start taking back what she'd stolen: my peace, my voice, my place in this house. Because no matter how loudly she screamed, no matter how deeply she humiliated me, she would never understand one thing: I might be old, but I am not weak. And as the darkness settled around me, I whispered to myself, firm and quiet, "This house has my memories, my love, and my strength. She can hit me, insult me, try to erase me, but she will never own me." That night, I didn't sleep much. The pain on my wrist faded, but the fire in my chest, that stayed. It was the beginning of something new, a reckoning, a quiet promise born out of pain. And deep down, I knew the next time she raised that ladle, I wouldn't just stand there and take it. Dinner that night felt less like a meal and more like a slow punishment. Every sound in the room seemed louder: the ticking clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the scrape of cutlery against porcelain. Even the air felt heavy, as if the house itself knew something had shifted. I moved quietly around the kitchen, setting plates, folding napkins, trying to steady my trembling hands. The burn on my wrist from earlier had begun to sting again. I ignored it, pretending the pain wasn't there, just as everyone else was pretending nothing had happened. David sat at the table, scrolling through his phone, his face illuminated by the cold blue light. He didn't speak, didn't ask about my hand, didn't meet my eyes. And Clara, she moved about the kitchen with an elegance that felt rehearsed. She hummed softly, like a performer keeping tempo to her own act, pretending the morning's chaos had been just another normal day. Her tune was light, almost cheerful, but every note made my stomach tighten. When she brought the food to the table, the scent hit me like mockery: soup. The same soup that had burned my skin hours ago. I sat down silently, folding my hands in my lap. She served David first, ladling soup into his bowl with care and a smile so gentle, so sweet, it made my heart ache. Then she turned to me, her lips curling upward just slightly, not in kindness but in triumph. "Careful, mother," she said, her voice honeyed but sharp beneath the surface. "It might be too salty for your taste." The words dripped with venom disguised as courtesy. David chuckled softly, still looking at his phone, not a cruel laugh, just a thoughtless one, but it stung all the same. I managed a small nod, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I'm sure it's perfect," I whispered. The steam from the soup rose up in curls, blurring my vision as I stirred my spoon. The smell of vegetables, salt, and humiliation filled the air. Each spoonful I took tasted of bitterness, not from the seasoning but from the silence. David spoke first, finally setting his phone aside. "Work was crazy today," he said casually, spoon halfway to his lips. Clara leaned forward eagerly. "Oh, what happened?" They began to talk, their words bouncing easily between them: projects, deadlines, coworkers. Not once did his eyes drift toward me. I sat there quietly, the clink of my spoon the only sign I was even present. At one point, Clara laughed at something David said and placed her hand over his. My son smiled back, the same smile he used to give me when he was a boy. That tender, warm expression that once belonged to us now belonged to her. And in that moment, I felt it again, the ache of being replaced. Not by time, not by distance, but by someone standing right across from me, under my roof, using my son's laughter as a weapon without even realizing it. Clara turned to me, her eyes bright and falsely innocent. "Mother, you're awfully quiet tonight. Don't you like the food?" I forced myself to meet her gaze. "It's fine," I said softly. "You've done a lovely job." She smiled, pleased not with the compliment but with my submission. David didn't notice, or maybe he did, but he didn't want to. He poured himself another ladle of soup. "Mom, you should eat more," he said absently. "You've barely touched your food." "I'm not very hungry," I murmured. Clara's voice slid in smoothly. "Oh, she had a busy day," she said, giving him a knowing look. "Didn't you, Mother?" Her words were light, but her eyes were taunting. I kept my gaze fixed on the bowl, pretending to focus on the floating bits of carrot and potato. Anything to avoid looking up. The clock ticked louder, each second stretched, slow and suffocating. It wasn't just a meal anymore, it was a test, one I knew I was meant to fail. Finally, I set my spoon down. The quiet clink echoed through the room. "Excuse me," I said softly, pushing back my chair. David looked up, mildly surprised. "You're done already? I'm tired," I replied, keeping my tone steady. "It's been a long day," Clara smiled sweetly. "Of course, rest well, Mother. We'll take care of the dishes." I nodded and turned away, but before I reached the hallway, I heard her laugh again, that delicate, victorious sound. In my room, I closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. I could still hear their muffled voices from the dining room. Laughter, plates clinking, water running, life going on without me. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the dim reflection of the lamp on my window. The silence was thick, pressing down on me like a weight. For years, I had dreamed of this, my son happily married, his home filled with warmth and laughter. But I never imagined I'd be the shadow in the corner of that dream. A mother shouldn't feel like an intruder in her own child's home. My eyes fell to the photo on my bedside table, me, David, and my late husband on his graduation day. We were smiling, arms around each other. I remembered that day so vividly, the pride, the joy, the feeling that no matter what, we'd always be a family. I traced my husband's face with my fingertips. "You'd know what to do," I whispered. "You'd make him see," but he wasn't here. And the truth was, maybe David did see. Maybe he saw everything and simply chose peace over justice. That realization hurt more than the ladle, more than the burn, because silence isn't ignorance. It's permission. A tear slipped down my cheek, hot and silent. I wiped it away quickly, ashamed of my own weakness. Then I caught sight of my reflection in the mirror, weary eyes, trembling lips, shoulders hunched. I didn't look like myself anymore, but beneath the sadness there was something else, something harder: resolve. Humiliation can break you or it can wake you. And as I sat there in that still, lonely room, I knew this silence couldn't last forever. Tomorrow, I'd start making noise, not with anger, not with shouting, but with quiet strength. Because people like Clara thrive in silence. They feed on it. But when the quiet breaks even slightly, their power begins to crumble. I took a deep breath and whispered to the empty room, "They can ignore me at their table tonight. But one day soon, they'll remember who built that table in the first place." The next morning, I would rise early as always. I'd make tea, tend to the garden, and pretend everything was fine. But deep inside, something had changed. The mother they ignored tonight wasn't gone. She was simply waiting, patient, silent, and stronger than ever. The morning light crept softly through the window blinds, painting faint stripes across the wooden floor. I woke up before the alarm, as I always did, years of habit, years of being the one who held a household together long before this one forgot I existed. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that hums under your skin where peace should be but isn't. I wrapped my shawl around my shoulders and stepped out onto the porch. The air smelled of rain and rosemary, my late husband's favorite scent. It hit me like a memory I didn't know I'd been missing. When David was little, we used to sit out here every morning. I'd hand him a cup of milk and he'd grin, his little legs swinging off the step as he'd say, "Mom, when I grow up, I'll buy you a house twice as big." I'd laugh, brushing his hair back. "I don't need a big house, sweetheart," I'd tell him, "just one filled with love." And now here I was standing in that big house he once promised, but the love had packed up and left. I picked up the broom and began sweeping the porch, letting the rhythmic motion calm me. The sound of bristles against the old wood used to mean home, comfort. Today it just echoed, hollow and lonely. When I came back inside, I stopped dead in my tracks. The curtains I had sewn by hand, gone. The floral ones David used to hide behind when he played peekaboo, replaced with heavy gray drapes that looked more suited for a hotel lobby than a home. The soft scent of lavender that used to greet me every morning was drowned out by something sharp and artificial, that citrusy cleaner Clara liked to use. The kind that smells sterile, the kind that wipes away more than just dust. I made my way to the living room, noticing more changes. The family portraits had vanished from the walls. The old oak cabinet my husband had built himself, the one that still carried his initials carved underneath the drawer, had been pushed out to the garage. As I stood there, surrounded by what used to be ours, I realized this wasn't my home anymore. It was a showroom, a picture-perfect place where I no longer belonged. I heard her before I saw her, Clara, humming under her breath, the same little tune she always used when she was busy making the world bend her way. I walked into the kitchen, forcing a smile. "Morning, dear," I said gently. "I can't seem to find the teapot. Have you seen it?" She didn't turn around. "That old thing," she said, opening a cabinet and rearranging plates that didn't need rearranging. "I threw it out. You should thank me." I froze. For a second I thought I'd misheard her. "You threw it out," I repeated. "Of course," she said breezily. "It was ugly and chipped. I bought a new one, stainless steel, modern, much better." I stood there gripping the broom so tightly my knuckles turned white. That teapot had survived 3 moves, 2 floods, and 30 years of family breakfasts. My husband bought it for me on our first wedding anniversary. I still remembered how proud he was when he brought it home wrapped in newspaper, saying, "Now you'll have something to make your famous morning tea in." I wanted to tell her all of that, how it wasn't just a teapot, it was a piece of a life she never knew. But what good would that do? She wouldn't understand. People like Clara don't see sentiment, they see clutter, so I swallowed the lump in my throat and said quietly, "You should have asked." She laughed lightly. "Oh, mother, you're so sensitive. It's just a pot, don't get dramatic." I looked at her, really looked at her. The woman my son had chosen, the woman who smiled sweetly but made every word cut like glass. "I suppose you're right," I said softly. "It's just a pot." But as I turned away, I felt something shift inside me, a small crack in the wall of tolerance I'd built around my heart. Behind me, she kept humming. That same tune. That same sound that made the walls of this house feel foreign. When I went out to the garage later that morning, I found the cabinet, my husband's cabinet, covered in dust and shoved into a corner. A stack of cardboard boxes sat on top of it like it was nothing more than a storage shelf. I brushed off the dust, tracing my fingers along the carved initials R.H. Robert Hayes. My husband's name, my partner, my anchor. The memory of his voice echoed in my mind, low and steady. "Don't ever let anyone make you feel small in your own home, Margaret." I whispered. "I'm trying, Robert." "I really am." That afternoon, Clara invited some friends over for lunch. I tried to stay out of the way, keeping myself busy in the garden. I could hear them through the open window, laughter, gossip, the clinking of glasses. Then I heard Clara's voice, sharp and amused. "Oh, my mother-in-law, she's around here somewhere, probably fussing over her plants again. She gets bored easily, poor thing." Poor thing. The words hit harder than the ladle ever did. I stood there, hands buried in the soil, heart pounding. For the first time in years, I felt like a stranger in the life I had built. That night, I sat alone in my room, staring at the empty spot on the shelf where my teapot used to sit. The space looked small, but to me, it felt like a wound. I thought about the home I once had, full of warmth, laughter, and love that didn't need to be earned. I thought about how easily it all vanished, how one woman's pride could rewrite history inside 4 walls. And then, quietly, I made myself a promise. If this house had forgotten me, then it was time I reminded it, and everyone in it, who I really was. Because a house may forget your presence, but it can never erase your roots. Tomorrow, I'd start taking back the pieces, not the furniture, not the dishes, but the dignity that once filled every room. I looked around one last time before turning off the light and whispered to the empty air, "You can change the curtains, Clara. You can hide the pictures and throw away the memories, but you'll never own the story of this house because I built it." And as the night deepened and rain began to patter softly against the window, I felt something return, faint but steady. The first flicker of the strength I'd forgotten I had. It happened one Sunday afternoon, the kind of day that used to feel holy, peaceful, almost sacred. The kind of day that once meant family gathered around the table, laughter spilling through the house, and the smell of warm soup promising comfort. Now it was just another quiet war disguised as a meal. I stood in the kitchen, stirring the soup slowly, the ladle gliding through the steam. A pinch of salt, a dash of thyme, a little love, the same way I'd always done it. Cooking, for me, was never just a chore. It was a ritual, a way of remembering my husband, of keeping my family stitched together through something as simple as a bowl of food. But even rituals can lose their magic when they're met with contempt. Behind me, I felt her presence before I heard her voice. The air shifted, colder, tighter. Clara stood with her arms crossed, her perfume sharp and heavy in the air. "Who cooks like that?" she snapped suddenly. I turned slightly, startled. "Like what, dear?" She rolled her eyes. "You don't just dump salt in like that, God, no wonder everything you make tastes like hospital food. Her words hit me harder than I expected. Not because of what she said, but because of how she said it, dripping with disgust, like every movement I made offended her very existence. I've been cooking for this family since before you knew how to boil water, I replied quietly, trying to keep my tone even. Oh, please, she said, waving her hand dismissively. You think I don't know how to cook, you just can't accept that someone younger might do things better. Before I could respond, it happened, sudden and sharp. The ladle in her hand came down across my shoulder hard. The sound wasn't loud, but it felt like thunder inside me. For a split second, I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My hand jerked, the pot rattled, and hot soup splashed across the counter, searing my skin. The smell of thyme and onions mixed with something bitter, humiliation. Clara's eyes widened slightly, but not with guilt. It was satisfaction. That'll teach you to stay out of my kitchen, she muttered under her breath. I stood frozen, staring at the small tremor in my hand, the ladle still in her grip. Then footsteps echoed down the hallway. David walked in, my son, my boy. He paused in the doorway, eyes darting from my trembling hand to Clara's flushed face. What's going on here? He asked, his voice already heavy, the voice of a man exhausted by battles he didn't want to fight. Clara turned toward him instantly, her face softening, tears springing to her eyes like she had practiced the move. She insulted me again, David, I can't take this anymore. Her voice cracked perfectly. I almost wanted to applaud her performance. I stared at her in disbelief, my throat tight with words that refused to come. I began, but my voice broke. I swallowed, tried again. I didn't, she stepped closer to him, clutching his arm. You weren't here, David, she started it, I was just cooking, and she came in and began criticizing everything I do. I tried to ignore it, but she wouldn't stop. David's shoulders slumped, his face etched with frustration. Can we please not do this today? He muttered. My heart sank. He didn't even ask what really happened. He didn't look at my red shoulder, or the spilled soup, or the trembling in my hands. He just wanted peace, even if it meant pretending the truth didn't matter. I wanted to scream, to make him see, to remind him of all the nights I stayed awake for him when he was sick, of the meals I cooked when we could barely afford groceries, of the sacrifices a mother makes quietly without applause. But I didn't, because in that moment I understood something painful and clear. I had lost my place in my own son's home. He looked between us, tired and torn, as if choosing sides was an act too heavy to bear. Mom, he said quietly, avoiding my eyes, maybe you should take a little break. A break. The words cut through me. A break from what? From cooking? From the kitchen? From being his mother? I blinked, trying to steady my breathing. A break, I repeated, the word tasting foreign and cruel. He rubbed the back of his neck. It's just, things have been tense. Maybe if you visit Aunt Grace for a while, things will calm down. Clara turned away, hiding her smirk behind the pretense of wiping a tear. I stood there, feeling the heat of the stove, the sting in my shoulder, the ache in my chest. The soup began to burn, a dark crust forming at the bottom of the pot, the smell rising between us like smoke from something precious turning to ash. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The only sound was the low simmer of broth boiling away. Finally, I nodded. Of course, I whispered, if that's what you want. David didn't meet my gaze, he just sighed and walked out of the kitchen. The silence that followed was louder than any shout. I turned off the stove, took a deep breath, and leaned against the counter. The ladle still sat there, resting on a spoon holder, innocent and gleaming under the kitchen light, as if it hadn't just been used as a weapon. Clara brushed past me, her perfume suffocating. You really should learn when to stop, Mother, she murmured, voice low and cold. Some people don't know how to leave gracefully. She walked away, her heels clicking against the tile. I stood alone, surrounded by the smell of burnt soup and betrayal. That was the moment it truly hit me. Not when she hit me, not when she lied, but when my own son, the boy who once swore to protect me, told me to take a break. A break from the home I helped build, a break from being part of his life. I sank slowly into the nearest chair, the exhaustion pressing down like a heavy blanket. My hands shook as I wiped the spilled soup from the counter, each stroke smearing the evidence of what had just happened. It wasn't about the soup anymore, or the kitchen, or even Clara. It was about the quiet, cruel truth of growing old in a world that forgets the hands that built it. That night, as I sat alone in my room, the house silent around me, I realized something deeper: respect doesn't die in one blow. It fades, little by little, until you wake up one day and realize it's gone. And when it's gone, all that's left is ashes. I looked down at my bruised shoulder, gently touching it, and whispered into the emptiness, "You can take my place in this house, Clara, but you'll never take my place in his heart. Not forever." The words didn't bring comfort, but they steadied me. Because no matter how many times the world forgets you, dignity has a way of remembering your name. That night, the walls of my room felt closer than ever, pressing against my thoughts. The house was silent, yet I could still hear the faint echoes of Clara's laughter from downstairs, sharp, hollow, victorious. Every sound in that house had started to feel foreign, like I was a stranger eavesdropping on someone else's life. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands resting on my lap, staring at the small crack in the wallpaper. For years, I had told myself that patience was strength, that silence was peace. But that night, silence felt like surrender, and I had surrendered long enough. Slowly, I reached for my old brown suitcase from under the bed. The handle was worn smooth from years of use, its brass edges dulled with age. It wasn't much, but it had always been mine, a small piece of my independence. I folded a few dresses, my Bible, and the photograph of David as a little boy, grinning with jam smeared across his cheeks. That picture had survived floods, moves, and even Clara's redecorating spree. It was proof of a time when love was simple, when my son's arms were small enough to wrap around my neck and his laughter could chase away any sorrow. My hands lingered on the frame. "Where did that little boy go?" I whispered into the stillness. Downstairs, the clock struck 10. I took one last look around the room that had once been mine, now filled with furniture chosen by someone else, curtains that smelled of someone else's perfume. Every corner seemed to echo Clara's voice, her presence woven into the air like smoke. It was time to leave before I forgot how to breathe. When I opened the door, she was already there, Clara, leaning casually against the hallway wall, arms folded, that knowing smirk playing on her lips. She didn't look surprised, maybe she had been waiting for this. "You see," she said softly, tilting her head, "some people just don't belong forever." Her voice was sweet, almost gentle, the kind of tone that could fool anyone who didn't know what venom hid beneath. I looked at her for a long moment, the years of quiet pain between us heavy in the air. 1,000 things I wanted to say burned on my tongue, but I swallowed them all. Silence, I had learned, can cut deeper than any insult. Without a word, I picked up my suitcase and walked past her. The sound of my steps on the polished floor was the only reply she got. As I reached the front door, I paused, my hand on the knob. I didn't turn around. "Take care of him," I said softly. My voice didn't tremble, not this time. And then I stepped out into the night. The air was cool and thick with the scent of rain. The streetlights stretched long shadows across the road, bending and breaking like the ghosts of all the promises I had once believed in. But for the first time in a long time, those shadows didn't frighten me. They felt like company, reminders that I wasn't the only one who had been bent and bruised by love. The wind brushed against my face, gentle, almost kind. It carried away the smell of that house, the bitterness, the silence, the unspoken grief, and replaced it with something clean, something that smelled like possibility. I walked to the bus stop at the corner, my suitcase clutched close. The old leather creaked with each step, and though my back ached, my heart felt strangely light. For years, I had thought rebellion meant shouting, fighting, proving yourself right. But that night, I realized that rebellion could also be quiet, as simple as walking away without looking back. The bus arrived with a hiss of brakes and a soft glow of headlights. I climbed aboard, found a seat by the window, and pressed my hand to the glass. The city slid by slowly, dark houses, flickering lights, lives moving forward without me. And that was okay, because I was moving too. When I reached my old neighborhood, it felt like stepping into a photograph, the familiar cracks in the sidewalk, the maple tree leaning over the corner fence, the faint hum of the bakery sign still buzzing after all these years. Reverend Cole's porch light was on, steady and warm. That light had always been a beacon for lost souls, and tonight it was mine. When he opened the door and saw me standing there, suitcase in hand, he didn't ask questions. His eyes were kind, full of the understanding only time and grace could teach. "Margaret," he said gently, "you can stay as long as you need." The way he said my name, softly, respectfully, nearly broke me. I smiled faintly, the weight in my chest loosening just enough for air to pass through. "Thank you, Reverend," I whispered. "I just need some time to remember who I am." He nodded, stepping aside to let me in. The house smelled of candles and old wood, of peace. Real peace, the kind that doesn't demand silence as payment. In the small guest room, the bed creaked when I sat down, and the blanket smelled faintly of lavender. I set the photograph on the nightstand beside the small lamp and ran my fingers over David's smiling face. Tears blurred my vision, but I didn't wipe them away. Some tears aren't for sadness, they're for release. As I lay down, the stillness didn't feel suffocating anymore. It felt like healing, the slow, steady kind that begins in quiet places. I realized something then, something I should have known all along. Losing my son's house didn't mean losing myself. I had built that home once. I had built love, warmth, and faith out of nothing, and I could build again. Because the heart of a mother doesn't die in the absence of her child's love, it waits silently for the day he remembers it. That night I closed my eyes and whispered to the darkness, "I forgive you, David, and I forgive her too." The words floated softly into the air like a prayer carried by wind. I wasn't running away. I was reclaiming something sacred, the right to my peace. And as the moonlight spilled across the room, I felt it, that small, fierce spark deep inside me that refused to go out. I smiled to myself. The world could take my home, my place, even my name, but it could never take my quiet rebellion. They always say karma's a slow cook, but sometimes it serves the meal right when you need it. Weeks turned into months. I found new mornings at St. Mary's, ladling stew into paper bowls with an old wooden spoon. No one there threw a ladle at me. Instead, people came to the counter and said, "Mrs. Hayes, that smells like Sunday." Those small thanks rebuilt me faster than any counselor could have. Then one damp morning, Reverend Cole pressed a newspaper into my hands. The headline sliced the air, "Hayes Construction under investigation for fraud." My knees went weak. David's company. My son's name in the same breath as words I'd never wanted anyone to read. Clara's name was there too, bold as a lie. The pieces I'd suspected slotted into place like an unwelcome puzzle. I called Amelia Rowe that afternoon, a lawyer a friend recommended. Amelia listened, then said, "Margaret, if she laid hands on you and tampered with accounts, we can still make this right." I handed Amelia the stack of papers I'd kept. Invoices hidden in drawers, odd transfers flagged on bank statements, the email asking to change tax records. I even had my little list of dates from the ladle incident, silly maybe to some, but to me they were proof. "This isn't revenge," I told Amelia in her office, the blinds throwing striped light across her desk. "It's justice," she grinned. "All right then, let's serve it hot." She moved quickly, filing a civil complaint and telling me how we'd coordinate with county investigators. If Clara had been stealing from the company she'd worked hard to cozy into, we'd follow the paper trail and let the facts do the talking. Word spread in quiet ways. Neighbors who used to nod now stopped to ask if I was all right. David called more, first practical, then raw with shock. He came by and sat on the porch with me while I showed him what I'd gathered. Watching him read the records was like watching a man wake up. Investigators came and looked through everything. Amelia stood by me at every meeting, making sure the story stayed true. It didn't take long for the truth to appear stark and ugly. Fake vendor invoices, transfers into accounts set up under other names, altered signatures. Greed had been precise and patient. Clara yelled and cried and staged tired performances. She accused me of jealousy and meddling. But banks and signatures don't listen to staged tears. They follow numbers, and numbers don't lie. As subpoenas landed and court papers piled up, I watched her confidence crumble. At one point, she burst into the house in a red panic and tried to make a scene, but the sheriff followed behind and escorted her off the property. The last of her bravado dissolved into the cold air, and she left with little but a suitcase and a face that no longer fooled anyone. We didn't throw a party when the civil suit went through or when the county announced charges. Justice is not a confetti moment, it's quiet and plain. But there was a night when, standing at the sink washing dishes after simple supper, David turned to me and said, "You did the right thing, Mom." When your child finally sees you, that acknowledgement tastes better than any headline. There were harder moments, threats, a hallway shove that ended with deputies at the door, the slow grind of court dates and accountants. We froze accounts. We filed restraining orders. The county pursued the fraud, and Clara's schemes unraveled under spreadsheets and subpoenas. Through it all, I kept stirring at St. Mary's. The rhythm of serving and hearing a simple thanks kept me steady. People there didn't see headlines, they saw a woman who ladled soup with care. That mattered. When the final settlements were reached and the restraining order put real distance between us, the weight that had sat over my chest eased. The house felt like a home again. David began to show up in the mornings, helping with coffee and chopping vegetables. We rebuilt the small rituals that make a life feel like a life. In one hearing, David stood and read a statement he'd written, voice steady but raw. He said he felt betrayed, that he had been blind, and that he owed his mother an apology he could never properly make. The judge listened. A clerk shuffled papers. The legal world and my kitchen table matched up. Clara faced consequences, restitution orders, civil penalties, and a bar from holding any financial position in the company. She left town with little fanfare. It wasn't about punishment for punishment's sake. It was about setting boundaries so families didn't fall apart in silence. Neighbors began to wave again without that awkwardness at the core. Mrs. Falk from 2 doors down brought over a pie for you and David, she said, and hugged us both. Small gestures each felt like sunlight after a long winter, and I learned something else important. I didn't need to be defined by what had happened to me. I was a woman who loved to cook, who remembered my husband's jokes, who knew how to mend a fence when it fell. I was more than the headlines or the bruises. I had a life that could be gentle and strong at the same time. Justice didn't roar, it came like soup, warm, steady, and necessary. It arrived because someone had kept documents, because a lawyer knew which questions to ask, because a son finally stopped looking away. It was practical, plain, and, in its own way, tender. That night I sat on the porch with my mug and watched the stars blink on. The air had a clean bite to it. I sipped my tea and thought about how small things, a teapot, a clock, a ladle, had led us here. The taste of justice, I realized, was not sweet. It was honest. As the night deepened, I felt my hunger ease. Truth had fed me. I had been sustained not by revenge but by fact and by the steady hand of people who believed me. For once, the world felt a little fairer. I breathed in deeply, the scent of rosemary on the breeze, and smiled. This was the sort of meal that filled more than an empty belly. It filled the parts of you that know you did the right thing. Justice arrives like warm soup, steady, honest, and filling. You know, they say life has a way of circling back like a storm that finally meets the calm it created. That day in court, I felt every circle close. I sat in the front row, my hands clasped so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The courtroom smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and tension, the kind of air you can almost chew. Clara stood at the defense table, and for once her perfect mask had cracked. Her hair, usually polished to perfection, hung limp around her face. Her eyes darted nervously toward the judge, the lawyers, the people whispering behind her. Gone was the confidence, gone was the cruelty, all that remained was fear. Behind her sat David, my son, his shoulders slumped forward, eyes hollow. He wasn't the man who once looked at me with silent disbelief when I tried to tell him the truth. He was a boy again, lost, ashamed, trying to find the way back to the mother he'd almost lost. The judge's voice cut through the room like a blade. We're here today to hear the case of State versus Clara Hayes. Charges include financial fraud, falsification of documents, and elder abuse. The words echoed through the room, heavy and cold. Amelia stood tall at the prosecutor's table, steady as ever, her tone measured, confident. Your Honor, she began, the evidence will show a calculated pattern of deceit, financial manipulation, property forgery, and acts of cruelty that no parent should ever endure from their own family. Piece by piece, she laid everything out, the fake refinancing papers, the emails Clara had sent under my name, the city letter about the address change, even the photographs of bruises on my hands. Each exhibit was a mirror showing Clara's reflection back to her, and with every piece of truth laid bare, I saw her shrink a little more. When my turn came to speak, my legs trembled as I stood. The courtroom blurred for a second, faces, lights, whispers, but my voice came out steady. I'm not here for revenge, I said, the words leaving my chest like a weight finally released. I'm here because silence lets cruelty grow. I taught my son to be kind, but today I'm teaching him something harder, that kindness must never mean surrender. The room went still. Even the air seemed to pause. Somewhere in the back, I heard a quiet sniffle, maybe a stranger, maybe someone who understood too well. Clara wouldn't look at me, her hands gripped the table so tight her knuckles turned red. The judge nodded, then looked at the jury. Minutes later, though they felt like years, the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts. No cheers. No gasps, just the ticking of a wall clock. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. Justice isn't a parade. It's a truth laid bare, raw, necessary, and cleansing. When I stepped outside, the sun was already dipping low, painting the courthouse steps in gold. The air smelled of rain and redemption. David followed me out, his footsteps slow, heavy. "Mom," he began, his voice breaking, "I don't deserve your forgiveness." I turned to him, and in that moment I saw the same boy who once held my hand when he was afraid of thunder. I placed my palm against his cheek, feeling the roughness of his skin, the warmth beneath it. "Forgiveness isn't about who deserves it, son," I said softly. "It's about freeing the heart that still loves." Tears rolled down his cheeks, and I brushed them away with my thumb, the same way I did when he was little. He leaned into my hand, and for the first time in years it felt like he was home again. We stood there for a while, saying nothing. The courthouse behind us buzzed with voices, reporters, and cameras, but I didn't care. For me, the noise had already faded. As I walked toward the parking lot, the sky burned orange and pink, the kind of sunset that feels like closure. Each step felt lighter, each breath deeper. This wasn't triumph, it was truth. It wasn't victory, it was freedom. And I realized something: a mother's strength doesn't lie in how much she can endure. It lies in how she rises again and again, no matter who tries to break her. Clara had taken my peace, my pride, even my place in my own home. But she couldn't take me. She couldn't silence the woman who refused to stay small. I stopped at the edge of the courthouse stairs, turned to the sky, and whispered, "You see this, Henry?" My late husband's name carried softly on the breeze. "Your girl stood her ground." Then I smiled. Not the smile of someone who won, but of someone who remembered her worth. Because sometimes the greatest lesson a mother can teach isn't through words or rules or sacrifices. It's through survival, and in that moment I knew I hadn't just survived. I had reclaimed my story. They thought they'd silence me with shame. Instead, they taught me how to speak louder than ever.